At the exact moment the world was being told that the war might be slowing down, the battlefield itself was showing no sign of stopping. Reports of continued military activity were still coming in. Naval movements in the Gulf remained under close surveillance. And across multiple layers of the conflict, the systems that sustain modern warfare were still fully active. What changed was not the war itself, but the narrative surrounding it. On March 24th, Washington began signaling something different. Officials spoke about progress, about the possibility of communication channels opening, and about a 15-point proposal that had reportedly been delivered to Iran. On the surface, it sounded like the first structured attempt to move the conflict toward a diplomatic outcome. But that signal did not match what was happening on the ground. There was no ceasefire, no confirmed reduction in military operations, no agreement acknowledged by both sides. In fact, Tehran publicly rejected the idea that any direct negotiations were taking place at all, calling such reports inaccurate or misleading. What emerged instead was a contradiction that is now defining this phase of the conflict. Two versions of reality began to exist at the same time. One built through diplomatic language, suggesting that a pathway toward de-escalation might be forming. The other, unfolding in real time on the battlefield, where military pressure continued to be applied without interruption. And that contradiction is not just a political detail. It represents a structural shift in how this war is being conducted. Because this is no longer a conflict moving step by step from escalation toward negotiation. It is a conflict where negotiation and escalation are happening simultaneously, overlapping each other, creating a situation in which signals become harder to interpret and intentions more difficult to read. To understand what this means, it is necessary to move away from the language of announcements and look directly at what actually changed on March 24th, and what did not. The first concrete sign of a shift came in the form of a delay announced by the United States on March 24th. According to multiple reports, Washington decided to pause planned strikes on Iran's energy infrastructure for a period of 5 days. Given the strategic importance of those targets, this decision immediately drew attention, because energy facilities in Iran are not only critical to the country's economy, but are also directly connected to global oil flows and the stability of maritime routes through the Strait of Hormuz. At first glance, the move appeared to signal restraint. In most conflicts, a pause in targeting energy infrastructure can indicate an attempt to reduce escalation or create space for diplomatic engagement. And in this case, the timing of the announcement, coinciding with public statements about potential negotiations, reinforced that perception. However, when the full operational picture is examined, a different reality becomes clear. The delay applied only to one specific category of targets. It did not extend to the broader military campaign. Strikes against Iranian military systems, including ballistic missile capabilities, naval assets, and defense-related infrastructure, remained within the scope of ongoing or potential operations. In other words, the core elements that define Iran's ability to sustain and project military force were not removed from the battlefield equation. At the same time, there was no evidence of a coordinated pause between the opposing sides. No ceasefire mechanism was introduced. No verification process was established. And no joint acknowledgement was made that hostilities were being reduced. Instead, military activity across the region continued in a manner consistent with an active conflict environment. Air operations did not cease. Surveillance systems remained engaged, tracking movements across both land and sea. Naval traffic through the Gulf continued under heightened monitoring, particularly in and around the Strait of Hormuz, where each vessel's passage now carries strategic significance. Within military command structures, planning cycles and targeting assessments also remained ongoing, indicating that operational readiness had not been scaled back. What this suggests is that the war itself did not slow down. Rather, its focus shifted. By temporarily removing energy infrastructure from the list of active targets, the most visible and globally sensitive aspect of the conflict was reduced. Energy strikes tend to produce immediate and dramatic consequences: fires, supply disruptions, and rapid reactions from international markets. Their absence can create the impression that the situation is stabilizing, but that impression can be misleading, because less visible forms of military pressure often continue beneath that surface. Targeting military systems, degrading capabilities, and maintaining operational pressure are processes that do not always generate immediate public signals, but they are central to how modern warfare is conducted over time. This is why the 5-day delay should not be interpreted as a pause in the conflict, but rather as a selective adjustment within it. The structure of the war remained intact. The mechanisms that drive it, surveillance, targeting, force positioning, and strategic planning, continued to operate. The only change was in how pressure was being applied and where it was most visibly felt. And that distinction is critical, because it explains why, despite the emergence of diplomatic language, the underlying conditions of the conflict have not fundamentally shifted. The war is still active, its systems are still engaged, and its trajectory remains uncertain. While the battlefield continued to operate without interruption, a second layer of the conflict was taking shape. This time not through missiles or troop movements, but through language. On March 24th, Washington began signaling that a diplomatic channel might be opening. President Donald Trump stated that the United States was talking to the right people inside Iran, suggesting that communication was already underway, even if not publicly acknowledged. Reports quickly followed that a structured proposal, described as a 15-point framework, had been delivered, outlining conditions that could potentially lead to de-escalation. From the American perspective, this was presented as progress. Not a finalized agreement, but a shift. A signal that the conflict might be entering a phase where negotiation, rather than escalation, could begin to shape outcomes. But that narrative did not hold on the other side. In Tehran, officials moved quickly to reject the idea that any direct negotiations were taking place. Statements from senior Iranian figures described such reports as false or misleading, emphasizing that no formal dialogue had been accepted. At the same time, Iran's publicly stated conditions for any future talks remained unchanged, and in some cases became even more rigid. According to multiple reports, Tehran's position included demands that go far beyond immediate ceasefire discussions: an end to military operations, guarantees against future attacks, and compensation for damages already inflicted. In addition, Iran continued to refuse any negotiation over its ballistic missile program, which remains one of the central concerns for both the United States and Israel. What emerges from this exchange is not a negotiation, but a disconnect. Two narratives moving in parallel, without alignment. From Washington, the message suggests movement, access, and the possibility of structured talks. From Tehran, the message signals rejection, skepticism, and a refusal to engage under current conditions. And between those two positions, there is no confirmed point of contact. This is where the situation becomes significantly more complex, because in most conflicts, negotiations follow a recognizable pattern. Signals are exchanged, positions are clarified, and eventually, a channel is acknowledged by both sides. Even when progress is slow, there is usually a shared understanding that dialogue is taking place. That is not what is happening here. Instead, what we are seeing is a situation in which negotiation is being discussed publicly, while its existence is simultaneously denied. That creates uncertainty, not just politically but strategically, Because if one side believes communication is happening while the other insists it is not, then every signal becomes difficult to interpret. A statement that appears conciliatory may not be recognized as such. A delay in military action may not be understood as a gesture toward negotiation, and a proposal, even if delivered, may not be treated as the beginning of a process. This is not simply a disagreement over terms. It is a disagreement over reality, and that has direct consequences on how the war evolves. Because when communication is unclear or disputed, decision-making becomes more risky. Actions are no longer based on confirmed intentions but on interpretation. Each side must estimate what the other is doing, what it means, and what might come next, without reliable confirmation. In that environment, even small miscalculations can have disproportionate effects. A delay might be interpreted as weakness. A proposal might be dismissed as pressure. A military move might be seen as escalation, even if it was intended as positioning. And because both diplomacy and military operations are unfolding at the same time, these interpretations are happening under pressure. That is what defines this phase of the conflict, not the presence of negotiation, but the absence of shared understanding about whether negotiation is even real. And as long as that gap exists, the war does not move toward resolution. It becomes harder to predict, harder to control, and more vulnerable to sudden shifts driven by misinterpretation rather than intention. While diplomatic signals were being discussed and disputed, a different kind of message was taking shape, one that did not rely on words but on movement. In the same 24-25-03 time window, the United States began preparing to deploy additional forces to the Middle East, specifically elements of the 82nd Airborne Division. According to available reports, between 3,000 and 4,000 troops were expected to be sent to the region, adding to an already significant American military presence estimated at around 50,000 personnel. This was not a symbolic move. The 82nd Airborne is not a static defensive unit. It is designed for rapid deployment, capable of being inserted into active operational environments on short notice. Its presence signals flexibility, readiness, and the ability to respond quickly to changing conditions on the ground. And that is what makes this development important. Because while one layer of the conflict was presenting the possibility of negotiation, another layer was preparing for scenarios that extend beyond short-term stabilization. Reinforcements of this scale are not typically associated with de-escalation. They are associated with contingency planning. They provide options. The ability to reinforce positions, secure critical infrastructure, respond to sudden escalations, or support allied operations if the conflict expands geographically. In this case, the timing is critical. The decision to prepare additional deployments did not come after a breakdown in talks. It came at the same time as discussions about talks were emerging, which means the United States is not choosing between diplomacy and military readiness. It is pursuing both at the same time. And that dual-track approach reveals something about how this conflict is being assessed in Washington. There is no assumption that negotiations will succeed. There is no clear expectation that the situation will stabilize in the near term. Instead, the approach reflects uncertainty, a recognition that the conflict could evolve in multiple directions, and that each of those directions requires preparation. At the operational level, this translates into maintaining pressure while expanding capability. Military forces already in the region continue to operate, and additional forces are positioned to expand the range of possible responses. This does not necessarily mean escalation is imminent, but it does mean escalation is being actively planned for. And in modern conflict, that distinction matters, because wars are not only shaped by what happens, but by what is prepared. The presence of additional forces changes calculations on all sides. For Iran, it signals that the United States is not preparing to withdraw or reduce involvement. For Israel, it reinforces the idea that American support remains available if the conflict widens. And for other actors in the region, it introduces a new variable: the possibility that a localized conflict could become something broader, depending on how events unfold. At the same time, the deployment of airborne forces suggests a particular kind of flexibility. These are not heavy, long-term occupation units. They are mobile, adaptable, and capable of operating across different environments, from securing bases to responding to sudden threats, which means the focus is not just on sustaining the current conflict, but on preparing for rapid change within it. And that brings us back to the central contradiction of this phase. Because while diplomatic language suggests movement toward resolution, military positioning suggests preparation for continuation. And when those two signals exist together, it becomes clear that the war is not approaching an endpoint. It is entering a more uncertain stage, one where multiple outcomes remain possible, and where decisions are being made not based on what is happening, but on what might happen next. While military deployments and diplomatic signals were unfolding almost simultaneously, a third layer of the conflict was being shaped through control. Specifically, control over movement in one of the most critical maritime corridors in the world, the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow stretch of water is not just a geographic feature. It is a strategic artery through which a significant portion of the world's oil supply passes every day. Any disruption here does not remain local. It is immediately reflected in global energy markets, shipping costs, and economic stability far beyond the region. In this context, Iran's recent messaging about Hormuz becomes particularly important. Rather than announcing a full closure or an unrestricted threat, Tehran signaled something more controlled. According to reports, Iranian authorities informed international bodies that vessels considered non-hostile could continue to pass through the strait, provided they coordinated with Iranian oversight. At first glance, this might appear to be a de-escalatory signal. It suggests that Iran is not seeking to completely shut down maritime traffic or trigger an immediate global economic shock. But that interpretation only captures part of the picture. Because what Iran is effectively doing is not stepping back from Hormuz, but redefining how control over it is exercised. Instead of a binary situation, open or closed, the strait is being transformed into a monitored and selectively regulated corridor. Every vessel is no longer just a commercial entity. It becomes a signal, a data point, part of a system where movement is observed, assessed, and, if necessary, influenced. This introduces a new layer of pressure into the conflict, because control does not have to be absolute to be effective. Selective control can achieve multiple objectives at once. It allows Iran to maintain leverage over global energy flows without triggering the kind of immediate and unified international response that a full blockade would likely provoke. It creates uncertainty in the market, which can drive volatility even in the absence of direct disruption. And it establishes a framework in which escalation can be increased or reduced incrementally, rather than through a single decisive action. At the operational level, this means that Hormuz is no longer just a choke point. It is an active management zone. Naval patrols monitor traffic. Communication channels determine passage. And each movement through the strait becomes part of a broader strategic calculation. For global shipping companies and energy markets, this creates a different kind of risk. Not the sudden shock of closure, but the ongoing uncertainty of conditional access. And that uncertainty can be just as powerful, because it affects decision-making. It influences routing choices. It shapes pricing, insurance costs, and long-term expectations. In other words, it extends the impact of the conflict beyond the battlefield and into the global economic system. At the same time, this approach allows Iran to align its maritime strategy with its broader position in the conflict. Just as the military campaign is applying selective pressure rather than total force, Hormuz is being used in a similar way, not as a single point of escalation, but as a flexible instrument. This is what makes the current phase of the conflict different. Pressure is no longer concentrated in one domain. It is distributed. Military, diplomatic, and economic layers are all being activated, each influencing the others. And Hormuz sits at the intersection of those layers. It connects battlefield decisions with global consequences. It turns regional tension into international impact. And it ensures that even when direct confrontation appears limited, the effects of the conflict continue to expand outward. While attention remained focused on Iran and the Gulf, a parallel shift was beginning to take shape further west along Israel's northern border. This shift did not come in the form of a sudden strike or a single dramatic event. Instead, it emerged through a strategic statement, one that carries long-term implications for how this conflict could evolve. Israel's defense leadership signaled its intention to establish a security zone in southern Lebanon, extending up to the Litani River. On its surface, this concept is not new. Variations of buffer zones have existed before, designed to create distance between hostile forces and Israeli territory. But in the current context, this move takes on a different meaning, because it is being proposed not as a temporary defensive measure, but as part of an ongoing and expanding conflict environment. For Hezbollah, which operates extensively in southern Lebanon, such a development is not neutral. It is viewed as a direct threat to its operational presence and influence in the region. And that reaction matters because Hezbollah is not an isolated actor. It is deeply connected to Iran's broader strategic network. This is where the structure of the conflict begins to change. Up to this point, the central axis has been relatively clear: the United States and Israel applying pressure on Iran. But with Lebanon entering the equation more directly, that axis begins to expand. The conflict is no longer contained within a single geographic focus. It starts to stretch, from Iran itself to the waters of the Gulf, and now to the land border between Israel and Lebanon. And each of these areas operates under different conditions. In Iran, the focus is on infrastructure and military systems. In the Gulf, it is about maritime control and energy flows. In Lebanon, it becomes a question of territorial presence and proxy engagement. These are not isolated fronts. They are interconnected. Pressure in one area can trigger responses in another. A move in Lebanon can influence calculations in Tehran. An escalation at sea can affect decisions along the Israeli border. This interconnected structure is what raises the risk level, because it reduces the ability to contain the conflict. When a war is limited to one front, its boundaries are clearer. When it spreads across multiple fronts, those boundaries begin to blur. And that is exactly what this development suggests. The proposal for a security zone is not just about defense. It is about shaping the battlefield, creating depth, extending control, and preparing for a scenario in which the conflict is no longer limited to direct engagement with Iran, but involves its regional network more directly. At the same time, this move complicates any parallel effort toward negotiation. Because even if discussions were to advance between the United States and Iran, developments on the Israel-Lebanon front could introduce new tensions that are not easily addressed within a single diplomatic framework. In other words, the more the conflict expands geographically, the harder it becomes to resolve through a single channel. And that brings us back to the pattern that is now defining this phase. The war is not intensifying in one direction. It is spreading across multiple directions at once, not through a single decisive escalation, but through a series of moves that extend its reach. And with each additional front, the conflict becomes more complex, more interconnected, and more difficult to control. To understand why diplomatic signals have not translated into actual negotiation, it is necessary to look beyond public statements and examine how decisions are being made inside Iran. Because in this phase of the conflict, what Iran says is only one part of the picture. What matters more is who has the influence to decide what Iran can accept and what it will reject. At the center of that structure is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, or IRGC. The IRGC is not simply a military organization. It is a combined military, political, and economic force with deep influence across Iran's strategic decision-making process. It operates missile programs, oversees key elements of national defense, and maintains connections with regional actors such as Hezbollah. And in a time of active conflict, its role becomes even more significant. Reports indicate that the IRGC's influence has increased as the war has continued, particularly in shaping how Iran responds to external pressure. This shift matters because the IRGC's strategic outlook tends to prioritize deterrence and resistance over compromise. From that perspective, accepting negotiations under pressure carries risks. It can be interpreted internally as a sign of weakness. It can affect credibility with regional allies, and it can reduce the effectiveness of Iran's broader deterrence posture. This helps explain why Tehran's public conditions for any potential talks remain so demanding. Ending military operations, securing guarantees against future attacks, and addressing compensation are not simply negotiation points. They are thresholds designed to reshape the balance of power before any dialogue even begins. At the same time, Iran's refusal to discuss its ballistic missile program is consistent with this logic. Missile capabilities are a central pillar of Iran's defensive and deterrent strategy. They provide reach, flexibility, and the ability to respond without relying on conventional air superiority. From Tehran's perspective, removing that capability from the equation would significantly alter its strategic position, not just in the current conflict, but in the broader regional landscape. So the refusal is not tactical, it is structural. And that creates a fundamental gap between what the United States is asking for and what Iran is willing to consider. On one side, Washington's reported proposal includes elements that would require major changes to Iran's military and strategic posture. On the other side, Tehran's conditions require changes to the external pressure it is currently facing. These positions do not overlap, at least not yet. And without that overlap, negotiation cannot move forward in a conventional way. Instead, what exists is a form of indirect signaling. Messages are sent. Conditions are stated. Possibilities are discussed, but no shared framework has been established. This is why the situation remains unstable. Because while diplomatic language continues to circulate, the internal dynamics that shape Iran's decision-making are aligned toward maintaining resistance rather than entering compromise. And as long as that alignment holds, the probability of a rapid diplomatic breakthrough remains low, which means that the military dimension of the conflict continues to carry the primary weight. And that brings us to the next layer of the situation: how the rest of the world is reacting to a conflict that is expanding, but not yet fully defined. As the conflict continued to evolve across multiple layers, military, diplomatic, and economic, the reaction from the international community began to take shape. But unlike previous crises in the region, this response has not converged into a unified position. Instead, what is emerging is a pattern of cautious engagement without full alignment. Some countries have signaled a willingness to support diplomatic efforts. Pakistan, for example, has indicated that it could act as an intermediary, offering a potential channel through which communication between the United States and Iran might be facilitated. This reflects a broader interest among certain states in preventing further escalation. particularly given the potential global impact of instability in the Gulf. However, beyond these limited signals, there has been no clear formation of a coordinated international response. Traditional U.S. allies have not moved decisively to expand their military involvement. There is no broad coalition forming around a shared operational objective, and there has been no collective framework established to manage or contain the conflict at a global level. This absence of alignment is significant because in previous conflicts involving critical regions or global economic choke points, international actors often moved quickly to define positions, coordinate responses, and establish clear lines of support or opposition. That is not happening here. Instead, each actor appears to be assessing the situation independently, weighing risks, and avoiding commitments that could draw them deeper into a conflict whose trajectory remains uncertain. Part of this hesitation is structural. The conflict itself is not clearly defined. It is not a conventional war between two states with established boundaries. It involves multiple actors, overlapping fronts, and different forms of engagement: direct strikes, proxy activity, economic pressure, and strategic signaling. This makes it more difficult for external actors to determine where involvement begins and where it might lead. Another factor is the economic dimension. With the Strait of Hormuz under increased scrutiny and global energy markets already reacting to uncertainty, many countries are aware that deeper involvement carries not only military risks, but also economic consequences. Any action that contributes to escalation could have immediate effects on oil prices, trade flows, and domestic stability. As a result, the international response has been shaped by caution. Diplomatic statements are made. Calls for restraint are issued. But concrete commitments remain limited. This creates a situation in which the conflict is both highly visible and relatively uncontained. Visible because its impacts are being felt across markets and political systems. Uncontained because no collective mechanism has been established to limit its spread. And that combination increases the level of uncertainty. Because without coordination, responses become fragmented. Different actors pursue different priorities. Signals are not reinforced. They are diluted. And in that environment, the burden of managing the conflict falls back onto the primary parties involved. Which brings the situation full circle. The United States continues to balance diplomatic messaging with military readiness. Iran maintains a firm position shaped by internal decision dynamics. Israel expands its operational scope along its northern border. And the rest of the world watches, reacts, and adjusts, but does not fully engage. This is not neutrality, it is distance. A strategic distance maintained in response to a conflict that is still evolving, still expanding, and still difficult to define. At this stage, the conflict is no longer defined by a single trajectory. Instead, it is moving across multiple directions at once, shaped by overlapping decisions in military operations, diplomatic signaling, and strategic positioning. That makes the immediate future difficult to predict, but not impossible to outline. Based on current developments, three primary scenarios begin to emerge. The first is controlled stabilization. In this scenario, indirect communication channels, whether through intermediaries or back-channel contacts, begin to take shape in a more structured way. The 5-day delay on energy infrastructure becomes more than a temporary adjustment and evolves into a broader pattern of restraint. Military operations narrow in scope, focusing on containment rather than expansion. This does not necessarily lead to a formal agreement, but it creates a form of stability, a situation where the conflict remains active at a low level while escalation is intentionally limited. At the moment, this scenario appears possible, but not dominant, because it depends on both sides recognizing a shared interest in reducing pressure, and that alignment has not yet clearly emerged. The second scenario is prolonged conflict under controlled pressure. This is the most consistent with what we are currently seeing. In this model, the war continues without a decisive turning point. Military operations remain active but selective. Diplomatic signals continue, but without producing concrete results. Each side maintains its position while avoiding actions that would trigger immediate large-scale escalation. In practical terms, this creates a sustained state of tension. Strikes continue. Forces remain deployed. Economic pressure fluctuates, especially around energy flows. And the conflict becomes part of a longer strategic cycle rather than a short-term crisis. This scenario does not produce dramatic shifts, but it extends the duration of instability. And that extension, over time, can have significant cumulative effects. The third scenario is sudden escalation. Unlike the previous two, this scenario does not develop gradually. It is triggered by a single event. That event could take many forms: a major strike on critical infrastructure, a direct confrontation in the Strait of Hormuz, or a rapid escalation on the Israel-Lebanon front. What defines this scenario is not the specific trigger, but the speed of response. In a system where communication is unclear and multiple fronts are active, reactions can move faster than coordination. Decisions are made under pressure. Signals are interpreted quickly, and escalation can unfold before diplomatic channels have time to respond. This is the most volatile scenario, not because it is the most likely, but because it is the least predictable. And that unpredictability is what makes the current situation unstable. Because all three scenarios exist at the same time, not as separate paths, but as overlapping possibilities. The system has not committed to one direction. It is holding multiple directions open. And that means the outcome will not be determined by a single decision, but by how multiple decisions interact across different layers of the conflict. What the past 24 to 48 hours reveal is not a resolution. It is a transformation. The conflict has not shifted away from force. It has expanded into systems, military systems, energy systems, and communication systems. Each of these layers is now operating at the same time, influencing one another in ways that are not always visible, but are always present. A delay in one domain does not stop the others. A signal of negotiation does not guarantee a reduction in pressure, and a movement on one front can reshape the dynamics of another. This is no longer a war that progresses step by step. It is a war that overlaps, where diplomacy and military action exist together, where signals are sent but not always understood, and where decisions are made under conditions of uncertainty. Because when a conflict operates across multiple layers simultaneously, clarity becomes harder to maintain. And when clarity disappears, risk increases. Not just the risk of escalation, but the risk of misinterpretation. And in modern warfare, that may be the most dangerous condition of all.